Hi, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1251st New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Kadar Brock and Jason Stopa. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Kadar Brock's abstract paintings are contemplative objects that foster a secular spirituality. They're created through a ritualistic cycle of addition and erasure and expound on themes of ruins, nostalgia, belief, and transformation. He lives in Ridgewood with his dog Sal and has kept his studio in Williamsburg in Brooklyn since 2007. And our host today, Jason Stopa, is a painter and writer living in Brooklyn. He received his BFA from Indiana University Bloomington and his MFA from Pratt Institute. Recent solo shows include Interior Monument at Sivil Domaki Gallery in Istanbul, Glass Arcadia at Thomas Park in Seoul, Korea, and DIY Paradise at Assembly in Houston. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to get us started.
Thanks so much, Chloe. Really appreciate it. Um, I'm going to introduce kind of my introduction to Kadar actually before we kind of kick off this interview. So I met Kadar virtually in 2012 after a group show that he had at the Whole Gallery, downtown Manhattan. And I had seen the work, I had seen the images, and the first thing that stuck with me is perhaps the thing that sticks with me the most now. One of those things was painting history. There's all of these layers of erasure and palimpsest, things that are removed and applied yet again, and then layers of his own personal history, elements of religious upbringing, images that appear and disappear. And this extends to paintings and even things that he makes like zines. And in this most recent show, there are even some small sculptures. So my first kind of introduction to kicking off our conversation, Kadar, is thinking about that, thinking about all of that history, thinking about those
Oof.
layers of paint. So you apply paint in successive layers and you sand away to reveal underpaintings. So that sanding produces holes, and the final work exists as this accumulation and a removal. And
Yeah.
so maybe for a general audience, maybe it would be interesting and helpful to understand how you began working this way, and if you see your paintings as a kind of an act of erasure.
Yeah, I definitely do see them as a kind of erasure. I also just want to take a moment and say thank you to Jason and the Rail and to Miles McHenry Gallery and Patron Gallery and all my friends and family and community that have been supportive and engaging and that are showing up today. Just really appreciate all that. Um, I really began working with erasure and deconstruction. Geez, I mean, yeah, that was like 2012, that show at the Hole. And even before that, maybe 2010, I kind of scraped and sanded away at my first painting. At that time, I was working with ideas of role-playing games, magic, and artist myths, things around, the kind of idea of genius and artist is shaman, artist is hero, these kind of things, all of which I saw as kind of like really baked into gesture and gestural abstraction. And I wanted to, yeah, just start kind of poking holes in that, to make a little bit of a pun. And one of the ways that I came up to try to do that, using some rules from the role-playing game of Dungeons and Dragons, was to look for rituals that I don't know, that would feed into this. And the translation I got into was this idea of disenchanting magic items. And the paintings that I was making previously were really based on these ideas of artistic autonomy, like automatically translating subjective experience through gesture, these kind of like real pillars of some of the Western narratives of abstract painting. And so I thought if those paintings are embodying that idea of magic, so to speak, if I could take and maybe erase them, then I would be disenchanting magic items. And so I tried to look at the things that were around me in my studio and in my day-to-day job, because part of this impulse was really about kind of taking down some of the like hierarchy in painting or the sanctity of painting, trying to just like make it a little more, find something a little more more mundane that I could bring in. And so like at at the time that I started using those materials, I was, putting up some new walls in my studio. I was doing a lot of art handling. And the tools that were ready at hand were bin primer, a razor blade, and a power sander, because those were all the things that I was using to make the walls clean and white and all this type of stuff. And so I thought, okay, well, let me apply the same logic of like, retreating a gallery wall or, fixing the walls in my studio to a painting. And so I took these older paintings out of my storage, unstretched them, scraped away at the kind of impastos and the topographies on them, and then primed them with bin primer and sanded them down. And so that was like the first kind of impulse to get into this deconstruction and get into this erasure, and I saw that as a way of kind of like, I think this will be a theme in our conversation today and in my work in general, but I saw that as a way of like taking these paintings that embodied or symbolized a certain relationship or point of view or set of beliefs and seeing if I could like undo them and see what stuck, see what would persevere, see what made sense.
Hmm.
And so yeah, that's kind of how I first got into, the scraping and the sanding.
You know what's fascinating about that for me to hear is how it's like both this kind of workman
Yeah,
attitude, like I'm
yeah,
I'm doing labor, I'm using all of these kinds of industrial materials, and then also there's these kinds of immaterial things that you're after, how you
yeah,
might be able to kind of get at these mythologies, if you will,
yeah,
and relationships to spirituality, which
yeah,
I think this is fascinating because you and I have a shared history, and so I think there'll be an
yeah,
opportunity to kind of dig a little deeper into that as well. Um,
yeah, yeah,
it brings me to this other point where, like, I was thinking about the exhibition itself at Miles McHenry,
yeah,
and walking through. There's this freestanding work that you had that's kind of like
yeah,
hung in the gallery in a way in which you can see both the front and the back of the work itself.
yeah,
And something I've been reflecting on is the way in which like that allows for this like participatory moment for the audience. The audience
yeah,
gets to engage with the work. They get to have this relationship to the thing as an object.
yeah,
And you've done that in past exhibitions. Then also in this one, you have these two benches, one's that's sewn on, one that's painted on,
yeah.
and those are also on display. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what your relationship to the audience is, what your relationship to participation in the space of the gallery is.
Yeah, I always, whenever I'm having like a proper exhibition, I always want to think about how people are going to be able to engage physically, and temporally with the paintings. I think that's something that's really, really important to me. Um, like side note, like time and an experience of time is something that clearly the paintings really are interested in, like slowing down time, ritual time, these types of things that are maybe in opposition or friction with a lot of the ways that we experience time in contemporary society and consume time through contemporary media. Um, and so I think like both reiterating that the paintings are objects and not windows or screens or portals is really important. And then simultaneously, with the benches, reiterating that not only are they objects, but they're objects that are meant for contemplation. And my goal is to create, a contemplative object, something that, as you touched on earlier, like dealing with the subject of spirituality, like at least can offer respite for someone who, maybe is consuming culture or, experiencing life at a different speed.
Hmm.
So I think that aspect of it is really important. And so, at the same time, you mentioned like palimpsest and this type of thing, all the benches, they're not benches that I got from the gallery or that I bought. They're things that I made that incorporate the materials from my studio. And so that gets back at this kind of like high-low, this kind of flattening of hierarchy, right? So like the bench that we're looking at now with the two weavings on top of it is like one of the tabletops I use in the studio, just with some 4x6s that I cut to bench height underneath it. And the weavings themselves are things that are made also from kind of maybe residues from the studio. The more colorful one that's kind of more forward in this image is made from accumulated painting rags. And the painting rags that I use in my studio are all in turn made from either old t-shirts, old bed sheets, these types of things that I have a very, you know, tangible, physical, domestic relationship with that then are recycled to be used in my studio that are then used as paint rags, cleaning my palette, cleaning my brushes, cleaning up maybe, I don't know, whatever else spills in my studio, that sort of thing. And then they were in turn, turned into this weaving. The impetus for the weaving was really a desire to create new textures that I could bring into the paintings. And so also then the lighter colored one, the white colored one, that's now more forward in this image is made from trimmings from all my paintings. When you finish a painting and are at the last stage, part of the thing that I have to do because I keep on the backs of my paintings, I keep kind of a little extra canvas because I'm always stretching and unstretching them, and so sometimes they shrink, and so I need a little extra material on the back. So I trim them down, and I've been saving that stuff for years and years, and I decided to make a weaving out of that as well. And again, like this idea that the weavings are also paintings in a sense, to the same extent that the other paintings are paintings, but these are also paintings that you can sit on. And then,
Yeah.
in turn, the viewer will sit on them and feel those textures, experience them with their body, and maybe they'll register that those textures and those patterns are the same, patterning that's in some of the paintings. Maybe they won't. That's okay, but it's there. It's there to be discovered, and that's available to the viewer as they
Yeah.
experience the show.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's this really unique, particularly complex relationship to materiality that's at
Yeah,
play,
yeah,
where in a traditional painting, for instance, we might talk about materiality in terms of like the gesture, the facture, the pressure of the brush on the surface, the
yeah,
accumulation of paint, the lack thereof.
yeah,
And we consider that to kind of all be in service of this image that the artist says I intended for this, or I accepted this in the end as a series of things, of a series of decisions that I've come to and have claimed as my own. And in this case, there's actually this much more roundabout way in which material might show up or not show up. So the way that
yeah,
that t-shirt or old painting or a painting rag might find its way back into a painting. And
yeah,
perhaps
yeah.
originally, maybe that wasn't even a thought. I'm curious just kind of as a follow-up, like to what degree do those things kind of sit around in the studio waiting for an eventual home or
Oh, all the
things like
time.
that? Yeah.
I mean, not that this is just anecdotal, but like I have probably 30 gallons of dust that I have no idea what I'm going to do with that I've been saving for about like 6 or 7 years. So I keep these materials around because at some point I know that I'll use them. And also, again, it's like it goes back to this like deconstructive impulse and this high-level impulse where, the brushstroke on the canvas has as much importance, or at least, there's no, I think it really gets at this kind of point of belief. And I mean, I guess I didn't mention this earlier, or get into it more in detail, but the impulse of using role-playing games initially was that was a critique or a kind of like prodding of this idea of belief in relation to gesture and belief in relation to the artist and belief that there is something necessarily transformative materially that happens when a brushstroke is applied with intention on the canvas or with feeling on the canvas versus when that paint is on the palette or when that paint is moved with a brush on the palette to mix color or moved on the can or onto a painting rag when I'm cleaning up the palette. Like it's kind of like trying to make equal or present as possibly equal all these different kind of ways in which the materials are pretty much the same, right? And the
Mhm.
real kind of effect of them or the real transformation happens through participation and belief. And that's something that I think is kind of I don't know, worth like prodding a little bit.
Yeah, I like to think that the modernists could have belief, or at least
Yeah,
they could try to rest on belief in the end, even if there was doubt, but trying to
yeah,
cover up all that doubt. The postmodernists, of course, really
yeah,
leaned into doubt and
yeah,
skepticism. And I really feel like we're in this interesting place in which belief and
yeah,
doubt are kind of happening simultaneously in an artist practice.
yeah,
And I think particularly in yours, it seems to kind of like it volleys back and forth as you kind of work. And this kind of brings me maybe to this next part, which is like
yeah,
how your subject matter really kind of finds its way in, which I think is this, other really unique place where we're left with all of these transparencies, the kind of
yeah,
the palimpsest that kind of creates this sanded, kind of meaty, dense surface, but then the puncturing of the holes And then we have these titles that kind of live alongside next to
Yeah.
all of this really wonderful exploration. Some of them contain partially rendered images and phrases on the paintings, and the
Yeah.
titles allude to a number of things. Like I was just kind of looking through some of the paintings in the show, allusions to
Yeah.
things like the soul. Obviously, the title of the show is Coming Home.
Yeah.
Auras, the self. Maybe you can walk
Yeah.
us a little bit through some of these decisions to kind of reference that both on the surface of the painting and then in a title.
Yeah, yeah. So the titles are all specifically pulled from source material that I'm using. So, and then also to get into how the paintings are made are through this process of essentially painting like full on image, largely image based paintings, like on the canvas in oil, and then deconstructing them through using just a window scraper, like a really simple window scraper, scraping away at them, and then eventually sanding them. And so each layer or each underpainting, so to speak, is typically pulled from. I mean, every now and then I'll use other imagery that I'm fascinated by or different aesthetic kind of things. But largely, 99% of the layers of underpaintings are pulled from, or the images are pulled from this archive I've been building since 2018 that is primarily focused on a new age religious group called the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness, or MSIA for short. I am fascinated by this group for a number of reasons, one of which is that my parents were involved in it when I was growing up and still are. So it was the kind of religious and ideological worldview that I was raised in. But also, a group like MSA is not an uncommon thing, specifically in America, specifically in the time that it was founded, which was in 1968. And I see a group like this and the guy who was its charismatic leader, this guy, Roger Hinkins, as just, a site or an example that I could tease out all sorts of things from. One of which, obviously has to do with belief and disbelief. I think you touched on this idea of like us being in this very kind of interesting moment. Um, that reminded me of one of my favorite religion writers talking about using this phrase like belief in a disenchanted world. Like, what do we do after, Weber's disenchantment of the world? Like, where do we land and how do we find meaning and how do we find the experience of the other? And for me, I feel like, painting for me is the place to do that and is the way that I try to navigate that in my own life and for my own self. And that's like trying to find a kind of, again, contemplative space through a more materialist approach to object and to ritual and to time. Um, but yeah, I mean, I could talk about MSL all day, but I don't know that I need to get into like the whole, like its whole history. But it's also really interesting because MSAA is part of this larger trajectory of thinking and belief, right? And that trajectory parallels with and intersects with the history, I mean, the history of abstract painting. And so, MSIA takes their cues at various points from Theosophy, for instance, which is, a more well-known new religion from the beginning of the 20th century. And, painters such as Kandinsky and Mondrian and Off Clint all were Theosophists. Off Clint was also a Swedenborgian spiritualist before Theosophy was founded, which was, later in the 19th century. Um, and so, I found it really fascinating to be learning this, ontology of a certain vein of like religious thinking and how that also connects to this history of painting.
Mhm. In a way, like these larger kind of desires for meaning, for significance, for truth, these
Yeah,
things that artists have been seeking and have been trying to kind of find a language for a very long time, maps onto abstraction and then maps
yeah,
onto this religious tradition, this new age
yeah,
spiritual tradition that your folks find themselves in.
yeah,
And that kind of, it dovetails neatly into this next question.
yeah,
And that's this long relationship that you just kind of gave a schematic for the art world and its relationship to spirituality,
yeah, yeah,
in which in the absence of the church having this relationship to commissioning painters, there's a kind of spiritual void that
yeah,
becomes quite apparent in the late 1800s, after this kind of romantic time period, and we're kind of looking at this possibility for how does art somehow talk about these almost questions and themes that almost feel as though they have no answer or are bigger than something that a single painting can address, but yet an artist wants to anyways. And
Yeah.
there are definitely artists today who I feel like shun this, who are like, I'm not interested in spirituality. And then there's others who very much embrace it. And
Yeah.
then there's the dark side of all of that, which is occult, like occult or cult practices.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it struck me in thinking about our talk, thinking about our conversations. I too am somebody who grew up in a cult, and so Kadar and I have
Yeah.
this nexus that we can spend hours on, but we'll try to keep it art centered. But but that America in general seems to have embraced a number of cult-like qualities, and by that I mean communities that have a charismatic leader,
Yeah.
groups that start to have an us versus them narrative, where it's like this deep, deep polarization, inability to kind of meet the other side anywhere. It's like it's an enemy.
Yeah.
And I see that not just religiously, but I see that just culturally, socially. The suppression of critical thinking, members who socially isolate themselves or feel alienated from other groups. So maybe you could elaborate on what you feel like for you today. Do you feel like you belong to some larger zeitgeist, if you will, that is like trying to address
Yeah.
spirituality in a kind of like post-religion kind of world, in a world that is like, I don't quite want to have my
Yeah.
foot into something organized, but I do feel like there's this relationship to, again, belief and
Yeah.
non-belief and things like that.
I mean, yeah, with that last part in mind, it's very straightforward for me to say that like painting is the place where I try to grapple with that, and specifically with my process and with the subject matter, I see this as the possibility of transformation, right? Transforming these images or these symbols from this previous belief system into something that might speak more towards what my own, you know, current, more atheist, more materialist worldview would be, and what I yearn for to at least come close to something that would be considered a spiritual experience, right? Both in the process of the making and then also in the final product and object. Um, the other kind of aspects and the ways that the subject matter connects and reflects contemporary American culture specifically is part of why I got interested in it in the first place. Like obviously I have this like longer personal history with it, and that's was part of the curiosity, and part of the drive was to, unpack my own upbringing and beliefs and make sense of this, you know, figure who I didn't really know that much about, who had an influence on how I saw the world, at least, through adolescence and young adulthood. Um, but I was also just like, who is this like weird, folksy, middle-aged white dude who all these people think has like the keys to the kingdom of God or whatever it is that he's calling himself? Like this almost like, what is that? What is that quality? Like, why does that exist? And why does that, I mean, at least in America specifically, keep happening? Like America has so many new religions, and even more so into our politics of today. Like we're in a politics of charismatic leadership. And I don't know if that is a direct reflection of the media that we consume, or the way media is now functioning through social media, through everybody in a sense trying to be their own little charismatic leader and have their own little cult following. I mean, we literally call the people we relate to on social media followers, like, just that sort of thing. But I thought, as something that I had a direct experience with and a personal interest in kind of unpacking, and also as this kind of like example of American culture, also as an example of that time period too, when it was found. I mean, the group still exists. They still have this mansion in Los Angeles. Like they have vegetarian lunches and a peace labyrinth you can go to. They're constantly posting on social media, like all this new material. And I mean, this is an aside, but like this group created so much crap. Like there's just so many like books and pictures and videos and recordings and all this stuff. Like it would be impossible for me as an individual to ever look at all of it. And I just like most of the stuff that I got was from visiting an archive at UCSB, where they had a collection of these, newspapers from, 20, 30 years of publishing, and, certain kind of other, paraphernalia, promotional materials, et cetera, et cetera. And I still have like thousands of images that I haven't used yet, and I can keep going. but yeah, I just thought the group was really kind of like a specific example of all these different currents in American culture that seemed really, like you're saying, like seemed really relevant to what's going on today in a wider sphere.
Hmm. A kind of microcosm of like this larger picture that's taking place. Um,
Yeah, it
yeah.
just seemed like more appropriate for me to try to talk about that stuff from something that I had a really niche and direct relationship to than trying to, make grandiose statements or anything, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, this is something I don't think you and I have ever really actually gotten into, but maybe you could talk a little bit about your palette. When I think of your palette,
Yeah,
there's this quality to it that like there's these kind of shimmering gradients, these really sensitively applied applications of paint. This one right in
yeah,
front of us right now on the screen is maybe a really good
yeah,
example of that.
yeah,
Um, where, there's this quality of that I associate with all kinds of optimism. And then there's
yeah,
a kind of like fading out of that very thing,
yeah,
almost as if we're looking through it from like the lens of history.
yeah,
This thing that has like faded over time, maybe brought back yet again. Can you talk a little bit about the desire for that, the where the
yeah.
color or associations of color come from?
I really love how you just described that. Like I have to like make a note of that. That was like really right on. Um, yeah, I mean, most of the colors are, I would say, influenced and informed by materials from the group. Like I really the so like the second source material image of this like kid in the on the beach, like, with this coming home thing is an advertisement. Yeah, that one. So this is like an advertisement for soul awareness discourses, which are the like monthly booklets that the church like produces and people subscribe to maintain their membership, their initiatory level, and to, kind of move up in the teachings and get further initiated into the church. And the colors of those book covers, like the binding on them, and this is reflected in the zines that I make too, because I try to directly reference the materiality of those and the colors of those, are this like really beautiful kind of rainbow spectrums. Um, and so the colors are like, I mean, I'm not like directly matching colors to that, but they're informed by that aesthetic, informed by this like, for a blanket term, like California New Age aesthetic,
Mhm.
you
Yeah,
know?
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And what's interesting in your practice is how everything has a kind of reference somewhere, which I think makes your work
Yeah.
particularly contemporary, and that it acknowledges that, yes, I'm making an abstract painting that exists in this kind of autonomous fashion in the gallery, but then it's
Yeah.
loaded. I'm baking in all of these references, not in a
Yeah.
way that's somehow like, well, here's an obvious occult symbol, or
Yeah. Yeah.
here's something for a viewer to kind of hang on in a manner that somehow almost becomes illustrative, but actually is about kind of somehow enfolding within the act of painting through the act of erasure, addition, subtraction, encases or enfolds, embeds all of the act of that as
Yeah.
part of the meaning. And I think
Yeah.
that's just such a significant thing for an abstract painting to be doing. It demonstrates itself. It's not telling me what it's about, it demonstrates what it's about
Yeah.
through its own performance of itself.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, the other thing that strikes me is that like maybe we could talk a little bit about your zines because like we're looking at all
Yeah.
these reference photos which are so wonderful. These
Yeah.
kinds of reference photos in these kinds of literature like always have these like innocent. Maybe we can go back to one of them for a quick second. They always have
Yeah.
this like
Yeah.
really innocent, benign kind of sense of wonder and like awe and like don't you want to come here? Like there's something
Yeah.
about it that feels like, yeah, well, I do want to come here. I do want to come home. I am interested in what this is trying to sell me. And I know you've made I
Trying to
want this
sell you.
right.
Exactly.
I want this propaganda that's around wellness or my own self-fulfillment or self-actualization, whatever that might look
Yeah.
like. Um,
Yeah.
and I know you've made zines, your own zines, that kind of reference some of this literature and then reference childhood, nostalgia. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your zines.
Yeah. So yeah, for each this started I guess in 2022 I started making zines, and the impulse is because I've been grappling with how to share more explicitly the subject matter and the source material without being didactic. I didn't want to I experimented with a bunch of different things. I did sets of drawings. I did paintings that were more explicitly of the source material that I considered hanging with the more abstract looking paintings. And all those felt um, too much like I was trying to like teach someone something. And I don't want yes, I want paintings to go in the world and get people to think and expand and all these types of things. But I don't want to sit there and like pontificate to someone, and I don't want to sit there and tell someone that they should be getting something or should be seeing this or should be getting this. I want to set up situations, and just in much the same way as the weavings on the bench in the gallery, I want to set up avenues for people to experience the paintings in multiple layers, and layers of experience, layers of intimacy, layers of engagement. And so, in much the same way that those weavings are there, I like to create zines that have all the source material from a specific exhibition. They're organized in ways that they kind of line up with the titles of the paintings. And then, that's an avenue for someone if they say, look at this painting and see coming home, finding a way home. And they open the zine and they see this image that says MSA coming home. And this is the most explicit one because you still kind of get some of the graphic you know, yeah, the graphics of that particular publication. But like overall, it's a way for people to then kind of start piecing together what these paintings come from, maybe to create their own narratives around them, and also to just share that I've been like digging up all this crap. And that this group that I'm interested in, I write a little essay for an introduction to them, kind of explaining what themes I see as developing as I'm piecing together the paintings, as I'm piecing together the images and the layers and stuff. And it's just a way for me to kind of provide more access and more intimacy with the work, should someone be interested and curious in doing that.
Hmm. Well, and then looking at your zines, the other thing that strikes me is that they're not unlike religious literature that might be
Yeah,
associated with some
yeah,
organized religion. It's
yeah,
not instructive, right? It's kind of
yeah,
like it's more open-ended than that. And the
yeah,
paintings do something similar. And maybe you could elaborate on that. Like for instance,
yeah,
I'm not going to name names. There might be people who have strong feelings one way or another about artists who participate in this. But some artists, for instance, some contemporary artists who are interested in issues of spirituality
yeah,
are quite explicit about the
yeah,
paintings somehow being reflective of that.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it tends to be something that actually almost performs the same function as maybe religious New Age literature that is
Sure.
kind of it's an invitation. It's an invitation to come to it. It's welcoming, it's inviting, so on and so forth. And your notations or images, like there's an image of this kind of cartoon figure from one
Yeah.
of the I can't remember which the title of that painting, but I think it's somewhere in the
Oh, yeah, yeah,
got this one
yeah,
right here. Here's what you think.
yeah,
They kind
yeah,
of
exactly.
they leave us in this place of like, okay, like what the entry point is obscure enough that I might be able to project a number of things into it before
Yeah,
getting to your content. Maybe you
yeah,
could talk a little bit about that, the kind of mystery or desire for mystery or withholding, maybe them
sure.
becoming like didactic or instructional. Like maybe you could elaborate on what that impulse is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this painting is, I'm like, I included this painting in the show specifically for this reason, because I do like to, again, like give these little clues for people to kind of start unpacking. And I thought the, the image of like this guy in the chair kind of in front of this, more abstract painting, and also the title of Here's What You Think, because it's like, I don't want to be telling people what to think. I don't want to be using the aesthetics of something that is telling people what to think. I don't want to be, um, I mean, I don't know, like some of the work that I think engages in quote unquote spirituality of the last, decade or so is more interested in the aesthetics of that than necessarily the practice of that. Like I know that Agnes Pelton's show at the Whitney had a huge impact on a number of artists and gave them a lot of permission. Same with the Off Clint exhibition. But Off Clint and Pelton specifically were deeply invested in very specific religions, and their work came out of that. So the aesthetics of those paintings are a reflection of that deep held belief. And I don't think anybody, I mean, this is a blanket statement, so bear with me on it, but like most of the people that I engage with who are making paintings, I don't think are involved in that type of like religious pursuit. And so to use those aesthetics seems, I don't know, like I don't want to mix messages with that. You know, I'm interested in creating this other kind of this other kind of conversation, this type of spirituality that for me is grounded in a kind of materialism and the day to day and in deconstructing one's own beliefs, asking oneself questions and trying to kind of like be more present instead of being engaged in fantasy, you know?
Mhm. I really love the way that you just kind of put that because there's obviously we're living through a period in which there's like aesthetics of optimization where it's like
Yeah,
how like the aesthetics of like a yoga studio in Brooklyn or the aesthetics of like the wellness industry or
yeah,
the aesthetics of spas, the aesthetics of like a lot of these places that really actually are to varying degrees absent of a kind of critical dimension. They become
yeah,
about like desire for the body to relax, desire to kind of escape a
yeah,
capitalist system in which you feel like you're being run into the ground. And
yeah,
you now get to step into this place in which you care about your body and your community. And
yeah,
it's on this very specific time where that happens. And so I'm thinking about those aesthetics as kind of being linked to a certain kind of escapist aesthetics, that it's like
sure. Yeah,
and
yeah,
that in order to make those critical, they'd actually have to be like they'd have to be angled towards somehow presenting that as an alternative,
yeah,
not as just a kind of like momentary transient escape or blip in one's day-to-day life.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it sounds like you're kind of interested in this middle ground. That happens in the paintings. It happens in the
yeah,
paintings where the paintings demonstrate the kind of conflicted, complicated nature of that, both kind of engaging with that. I know you have a meditation practice. I know that
yeah,
you have relationships to these things, and then also kind of like see them at this distance, kind of like
yeah, yeah.
it's a both and conversation.
Both end is the really optimal phrase. When I took that trip to UCSB to get into these archives, I was lucky enough to meet this religious studies professor, Ann Taves, and talking to her, she's just her viewpoint when she writes very like she incredible writing. She talks about Mormonism, she talks about a bunch of other newer religions in America, and she really takes this viewpoint of like both end, right? Like this person in this religion is having this experience and that is real for them. And also at the same time, let's look at the context of what they're experiencing that in. Let's look at the context of what's going on in their life. Let's look at the context, the material context of their existence, and try to make sense of that from a naturalistic viewpoint. And I think that if one can make an analogy of that to painting, it's like I'm not interested in creating a window. I'm not interested in creating a portal. I'm interested in finding something here and now through repetitive labor, through painting and through these other actions that I can take to create like I'm making objects. I'm making things that are here and now and that are not to transport you somewhere else. They're about, dealing with deconstructing beliefs and trying to transform these previous things into something that can like be a contemplative object in the present moment.
That's such a beautifully put way of thinking about these dualities.
Yeah,
Um, it makes me reflect a little bit on the way in which painting can kind of like become this container for things that are incredibly difficult to articulate in maybe almost any other forum.
yeah,
And it also makes me reflect on the nature in which abstraction has to then kind of wrestle with things that are outside itself. So it winds up wrestling with technology.
yeah,
It wrestles with issues of the marketplace. It wrestles with issues of sincerity. And you're kind of like this middle ground again, another duality, this relationship between a desire for a kind of sincere exploration of self, a sincere exploration of what the possibilities for abstract painting can do, and
yeah,
then almost this desire for um, getting away from subjectivity, getting away from the self altogether.
yeah,
And that those things are kind of also happening at the same time.
Yeah.
we're living in a moment in which authorship, branding, the artist
Yeah.
identity, their mythos, their whole
Yeah.
sense of self is like wrapped up now in the self-promotion part of being an artist.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
talk maybe a little bit? I know you and I have had private conversations about this, but maybe you
Yeah.
can talk a little bit about like how do you see yourself in all of that? This you
Oh,
we began the conversation talking about the sense of genius or the originator, all of these mythologies and abstraction. And I know you have a lot to say about something like this. So maybe you could kind of give us a little teaser into like your
uh,
insights into that.
oh, I don't know. Everybody should just join my cult. I'm just kidding. I mean, geez, yeah. A big impulse for making paintings like this is to resist, like I was talking about earlier, speed, like speed of media, speed of consumption. I don't make a lot of paintings a year. A lot of the time I spend just looking at them, deciding whether I need to scrape and erase them or not, and where they're at. And I think there are paintings that reward and are meant to see in person for a long period of time, sitting on the furniture that I've made. Um, and I think that as a position is in contrast to what we're talking about, like, or what you're talking about, like this building up of like, I mean, yeah, I posted a lot of stuff on Instagram for this talk because I want people to come and hang out and everything, and I have to post images on the show because that's part of like my now professional job as someone who needs to promote themselves because I don't have a studio manager. I don't have assistants. It's just me in here doing this work. And like I do all those, I wear all those hats. And, thankfully I work with some great galleries who also can wear those hats and take some of that work off. But I don't know it's a lot, each artist has a lot of responsibilities that we didn't necessarily sign up for or asked to do with the desire and impulse to just to make the work.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, something you just said reminded me to kind of get back to this, just framing it around the work. Like looking at this painting, it's 2017 to 2025. So there's
Yeah.
eight years went into this work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this relationship to time and labor in a painting.
Yeah.
Do some paintings arrive in the course of a few months versus a few years? Do works ever get a second revival, or do they just get discarded? Like, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this painting specifically had a previous incarnation that just again, like at the beginning, hung out in my storage for a little bit, and I was like, I'm going to take this painting out and work on it some more. I don't, maybe this is just partly economical. Obviously, it's not, but like, yeah, I don't like painting supplies, canvases, all this stuff is super expensive, and I'm already quote unquote wasting plenty of paint as I scrape it off and like erase all these things. So like I don't like letting anything in the studio really go to waste. And so I want to keep working on things. I also just have this, degree of kind of self criticality where if I hang out with a painting too long, I'm gonna end up not liking it. Like anything that I make, I eventually, I mean, sure, I like most of my work. Like I'm very happy with the show, don't get me wrong. But if I sat with one of those paintings for 3 more years, I would probably start working on it again because I'll be in a different place or have a different idea or, have a different vision or whatnot, or it'll evolve or whatnot. I do every now, like that little painting, the little cartoony painting that I put in the show. Every now and then I save things like that. I'm actually looking at kind of through this into my spray booth where I have a painting, just a straightforward cartoon painting that I saved from, I don't know, probably 2019 or something like that, that I'll never paint over and I'm just going to keep for myself. But there's this very kind of like, I sit around and I look at my paintings all day and then I don't like them, so I work on them. And
I
then I
so
keep working on them until it kind of like does something where I'm like, oh, okay, like I can't, this doesn't bother me anymore, you know?
so it goes through this kind of like self-critical hazing process where it's
Yeah.
like, can I keep it around and still see something in it?
Yeah.
What do you feel like is the criteria for saying I can't live with this thing? Does that happen to you? Are there paintings that simply can't be sanded down and added and
No, I could always keep going.
subtracted yet again?
Yeah, it could
Okay,
always
all right.
they could always have more life because that's just more history, right? And that's what I'm talking about. It's just that history of interaction with the object. It's like, this kind of ritualistic time and space. which I think is again, in contrast to the way that time is normally structured, consumed, and handled these days.
Yeah, so it sounds as though they kind of go through a process as well where um, anything can be yet again redeemed.
Hopefully.
It could be transformed potentially,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that possibility is on the table for you creatively,
Yeah.
which kind of changes the stakes around an artist thinking about their work as like, well, here's the masterpiece, so to speak, and
Cool.
here's something that I feel is like
Yeah.
maybe lesser than, and that a lot of your project is also trying to kind of like get away from that kind of thinking itself, this kind of
It's too
hierarchical
much
kind of
it's too
thinking.
much pressure on me. I hate standing in front of a white canvas. I like all the canvases start. I like add some other primer to them. I like use them as drop cloths in my studio or in my spray booth. They'll get information as I'm layering other paintings. Like the lone artist in front of the white canvas is like terrifying to me. And I don't like it. I think it's distasteful. I think it's like it's too grandiose. Like I don't want to be grandiose. I'm a guy making these things that speak to like me passing my time and spending my life doing something that hopefully gives it some semblance of meaning and community that I could share with other people. And like yeah,
Yeah.
like the idea of making a masterpiece like makes me want like I literally feel like a little nauseous at the idea of it. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
Because like who am I? I'm just some, I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't think I could, you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Well, it's what's interesting about the project as well. The paintings pack in so much. The paintings
Yeah.
pack in all of this relationship to time, a
Yeah.
deep sensitivity to vision and being able to perceive the thing and being able to sit with it, and that there's the promise that that's going to have a relationship on the audience, and
Yeah, I
that
hope so.
we're going to be able to kind of like also kind of get to this place of aesthetic and content appreciation that allows us to kind of like think about our own relationship to our bodies, our relationship to time, our relationship to these aesthetics. And then also they kind of operate in this other way. They operate in this way that's like it's non-hierarchical, not
Yeah.
interested in these kinds of like patriarchal notions of genius
Yeah.
and these mythologies that are attached to it, and then are deeply materialist. So they're kind of
Yeah.
embedded into a relationship about materialism and the politics of materialism, and in that sense, there's even a kind of relationship to notions of Marxist thought that are in there.
Sure. Yeah.
There's like multiple things that the paintings kind of touch on while also retaining a wonderful kind of sense of color, of
Yeah.
light, of surface, and of their own kind of like physicality in the space. So you're kind of like
Yeah.
operating in this kind of space between multiple
Yeah.
narratives
Yeah.
that kind of launch the paintings out into the world. That
Yeah.
might not always be obvious to the general passerby until they
Sure.
start to have that kind of sane material relationship to them, maybe
Yeah.
unpack how they were made.
Yeah.
Um, do you feel like there are artists that this might be maybe one of my last questions. Do you feel like there are other artists who you feel like operate within this kind of world in which they're kind of like pulling in from a lot of different sources, distilling something down into something like that offered a roadmap for you at the start of your career, or still offer some roadmap like that for you in your career today?
That's a really tough question. I mean, I think to that same end, I kind of just pull from a lot of different folks that maybe offer different portions of these things, you know. Like I remember you and I went to this talk about Simone Hantai, maybe a year and a half ago, and there was this conversation about collaborating with chance, and that turn of phrase was like really resonated with me because it's like, oh, this is part of what I do, and this is a way that I can make paintings that also, again, like maybe dodge or avoid or put aside some of these other mythologies that I feel uncomfortable with. So someone like that, I mean, obviously, like that, Jack Whitten's work is incredible. That show is incredible. His way of using materials and being expansive with materials, and applications and all that stuff is super inspiring. Um, geez, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I like your work. I like our conversations around utopia.
Hmm.
We didn't even start talking about ontology and nostalgia, but like, again, like this idea of like lost utopia is a theme that I think is really important that I know you really speak eloquently of. Um, and honestly, just like my friends and colleagues, like you among them, Mark Gibson, who has been a close friend for, decades, like just his approach to materials and process, even though we're doing very different things, pictorially. Um, but Lydia Donna, who's been a teacher and mentor of mine since undergraduate, it's really like the people I have relationships with and people I have conversations with that have really kind of fed my practice and informed me, I think.
Yeah, I love that list, not just because I'm on it, but I wanted to also comment on this thing that you just said about lost utopia. That might be a great way to wrap up our conversation before this Q&A. Maybe you could
Yeah,
say a little bit about like obviously MSIA has this utopian vision of the future. That's also
yeah,
baked into modernism, right?
yeah,
Modernity has these mythologies of this
yeah,
future moment in which the world will be better, that the avant-garde has a
yeah,
vision of that. Architects like Le Corbusier have a vision of that. There's philosophers who are thinking about these things. I'm
yeah.
curious, maybe if you could speak a little bit about that. Like, do you feel as though, in the absence of that, that all there is a nostalgia for a future that never came, or is there something
Oof.
else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'm kind of trying to navigate. Exactly. There is this feeling of a lost future that never happened. You and I have talked about that in terms of our religious upbringings, but I think that's also a theme and an experience that's really present in American culture at this moment.
Did we lose Kadar?
I think we may have lost him.
Okay, let me.
Elaboration on
There we go.
nostalgia and different a lot.
I
Sorry,
think I,
Kadar, we lost you for a second. Do you mind going back and
Oh,
repeating yourself?
oh
I'm
yeah, I saw
sorry.
that it froze. I thought it was on Jason's end.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so hauntology as this idea of like the loss of a future that never happened, right? The idea not and nostalgia as intersecting with that longing for something that never happened, as opposed to a longing for something that was there that we've already lost and we have to look back to. The segments of an essay that I'll read later are about nostalgia from this writer Svetlana Boym, who I think offers two really interesting kind of categories of nostalgia that talk about one that she calls restorative, which is a looking back to an absolute truth or a desire to restore an absolute truth, and then reflective nostalgia, which talks more about this like in between space, this experience of longing, this desire to unpack and deconstruct, and maybe parse out what can be brought forward into the future from these things that have maybe not come to be or things that have failed us.
yeah. I love that, and looking forward to hearing more about that. I'll just end with saying that the Timothy Snyder, this talk that you and I went
Yeah,
to, the Yale fascist historian, talked about
yeah,
how what fascists and authoritarians do is steal the idea of the future, and that there's
yeah,
only this retrospective past that one can long for, and
yeah,
that we're in dire need of some new idea about a future. So with that,
yeah.
I'll kick it back to Chloe, and we'll open it back up.
Jason and Kadar, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. Thank you. And I have a few questions from the audience. If you are an audience member listening right now and you would like to ask a question, there is a link in the chat where you can post your question to us, and we'll turn to you next. The first question is going to be from Josh at the Rail. Josh, I'll give you the chance to ask.
Hello, hello. My question is, do you ever lose anything unexpectedly in the processes of subtraction that you apply to your canvases? And sort of as a follow-up to that, have any of these processes revealed any other lines of inquiry that you would like to continue to explore in your future work?
Um, I think to answer the first part, I treat the whole surface the same. So there's not, so all of everything that I lose is kind of by chance. Like I'm not specifically erasing one area and preserving another area. Like I treat the whole object in the same way. And so I don't have control where the holes happen. I don't have control where a little bit remains. It's more that's more this like collaboration with chance. Um, but yeah, there are a lot of things that end up happening in the paintings, like with this show specifically, and with my work in general over the last maybe like 3 years. I am trying to allow um, just more stuff to happen, for lack of a better word. There's that painting that's suspended in the space. That painting only had really one underpainting that went into it, and after I erased it and started painting on it again, there was an intersection of some of the abstract information that I was putting down and the source imagery that was just so like struck me so much that I was like, all right, I need to preserve this. I need this to not be buried under more information. And so it kind of went through the next step of sanding it on this texture and bringing that texture in, and the kind of resonance between those two things was like, I don't know, it did something for me that I hadn't allowed happen in my practice before, because I was being so rigid about performing all these tasks. And so like when those things happen, it's really exciting. I'm also trying to, this is going forward and kind of off topic, but I'm trying to bring in more external information into the paintings aesthetically, whether it's, I have like, I don't even know that I would call it a practice, but like when I travel, I take pictures of a lot of things, architecture, surfaces, textures, materials, all these things. And I have years of these photographs that I've taken as inspiration. And now I'm finally getting to the point where I'm like, okay, I need to like print these out and have them up in my studio so that like when I need, or when I'm interested in bringing in some other kind of aesthetic phenomena into the painting that still talks to this larger kind of idea of around nostalgia, around ruins, around decay, around deconstruction, I can bring in, a painting I'm working on now. I just took I spent a month in Berlin this summer and was photographing some tiles in this architectural space in East Berlin. And I was like, okay, there's cracks in these tiles. These are interesting. I'm going to bring them into my works, because it's also talking about loss of a utopic space, right? It's also talking about this collapse of a different kind of political orientation, worldview, etc. And so like there's enough of a parallel there with the kind of ethos of that arc, I guess you could say, that I'm like, okay, I can bring this into the painting because I'm also drawn to it, and I need to give myself more permission to like bring those other things in.
Thank you for that question, Josh, and thank you for that answer, Kadar. Danielle's going to ask the next question. Danielle, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Hi, Kadar and
Hey,
Jason.
Danielle.
Thank you so much. Such a
Hey,
great
Danielle.
question. I had a very similar question, so now I have to think on my feet a little bit on, um, I'm looking at the duration of many of the works, which are over, some of them for 5 years.
Yeah.
And a question I had, and you answered this just, about painting, but maybe what are the more spiritual discoveries that you have in this constant loss? And also, I think the idea of scraping, or this ritualistic idea of squeegeeing or scraping, if you can talk about that a little bit. But I'm curious what you've discovered now that they've been made after this long period. I know it's a really hard question. I'm sorry.
No, no. I mean, well, like, let's see. I mean, like, can I take that as asking like where I'm at with
You could
my
take
relationship to spirituality in a sense, or something like that? Is that kind of where this is going?
absolutely. Sure.
Okay, so like, I was fortunate enough to do this residency in Japan last summer, and I was, one of the kind of like day trips that I did was to go to a bunch of temples in the surrounding area. And at one of these temples that has these incredible, stone carved tombstones for some of the monks and whatnot. Well, there's like a video playing to kind of teach you about their beliefs. And one of the phrases was like, you're born, life is wondrous, and you die, right? And so like that's kind of where I'm at. And that's kind of where I'm at, like speaking about the paintings as materialist, speaking about the paintings as like in this like performance of ritual, or this like performance of an action that has meaning to me, on subject matter that has meaning to me, that I can then also extrapolate and speak to larger meanings and hopefully connect with other people about. Like that's what it's kind of about for me. It's like, how do I do something that has meaning and it has significance, that I can then have conversation with people and connect, that also reflects on like, I don't know, just the beauty of everyday life, you know?
Great. Fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Danielle, and thank you for that answer, Kadar. I've got a question from Amy in the audience for me to ask because Amy's connection is a little unstable. Amy says, "Thank you both for the talk. Kadar, do you see showing art as another option to the search for charismatic leadership or to cults of varying natures?" And then it says, "which could address a current condition of deeper unease residing within us that seeks connection and a way to navigate the terminal nature of being human."
Can we put that in the chat so I could read it?
Yeah,
I want to make sure I fully
yeah,
understand
got it.
what it's saying
One,
because
I'm gonna,
the beginning of the question has me reflecting on the kind of like constructs of what Jason and I were talking about earlier around like around what's the right way to put it? Sorry, I'm scrolling down to this. Uh, sh- Another option for this into the search. Well, because I mean, there's a dynamic implicit in some of the ways the art world functions and the way marketing functions, the way personality functions. There is a way to talk about this insofar as like some artists are cult leaders to an extent, right? There is this degree that artists are in a way trying to convert or convince people that their worldview is correct and to follow it or get aligned with it or at least spend money on it. Um, but I do think people are looking for connection. I mean, I think and I know for a fact this is something that I tried to address, in that with the essay in the zine that's coming out, and also with the conversation in the press release and the conversation with Alex Bacon. Thank you to him for the wonderful catalog essay that he wrote. But the church MSA, for instance, like uses a lot of language that deals with the idea of coming home and also belonging, and that is like a very basic human desire and need. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think art is a different place that you can experience that type of connection and that type of, quote unquote coming homeness. And hopefully it's
Yes.
in a dynamic and space where it's not exploitative. I don't know. Does that make sense?
thanks for that answer, Kadar, and thanks for the question, Amy. Kadar, I'm curious a little bit about your mark making.
Yeah.
And, I feel like you're doing this process of sanding at the end, but it's
Yeah.
not in an effort to sort of unify anything or to, oh, sorry, it's not in an effort to like get rid of the electricity of all of this layered color. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
more as this way to increasingly reveal the way that they interact with each other in a way that maybe is outside of any intentional mark making and sort of exists alongside your practice making marks as well. And I'm curious about like your vocabulary, like the various line structures and drips and folds and holes and sort of how that developed in the studio.
Um, how do I answer that? I mean, when it comes to the painting part of the painting, it's
Hmm.
very like I kind of like maybe this is a good way to talk about it. So like as I've kind of like these paintings have evolved and this process has kind of evolved, one of the things that has become really great is that when I first started erasing things, I was taking older paintings that I had made and erasing them, and then I ran out of those paintings, and I was like, well, what do I do? Do I start making new paintings? Do I not make new paintings? And I was like, all right, let me try to make new paintings, and that opened up this whole realm where I could just like paint without a certain type of consequence and kind of
Hmm.
trust my own um physical dexterity and my own relationship to color and all these things that are just kind of embedded in painting for now, whatever, 35 years or whatever it is. And so like in that realm of my overall process, I kind of just, I don't know, I get to kind of not think about it as much, which is really nice. There is this degree to which in the show now, particularly that I've started going back in as a final like a final step and doing these very kind of like slow and gentle touches onto areas that have been like over eroded. That's part of why I started making the weavings to bring more texture and that could then get more eroded that I could then go in and fill in.
Hmm.
Um, that came from a like literally problem solving desire to like be like, all right, I have this thing happening where I sand it down or I scrape it down and like it's all the way to the canvas. Like, is there a way that I can make those spots like have a different color or have more noticeability or be aesthetically integrated in a different way. And I tried, soaking them. I tried staining the backs, which is why a lot of these paintings have this bright color on the back, which you see in that one piece that's suspended. And then I remember having a studio visit with this painter, Jim Lee, who shows at Nickel Bushin, and who I've known for, well, like probably like, I don't know, 18 years now or something like that. I met him when I worked at a gallery he showed at. And he's like such a hilarious and pragmatic guy. He's like, you don't have to tell everybody how you make everything. You just got to like do the thing. And usually I'm not like that. You can see I'm very literal and straightforward in how I paint. And so I was like, all right, well, I want these parts to be a different color. Like maybe I'll just paint them a different color. And so I started going back in, and that allowed me to also bring in this other type of gesture that I wanted to explore, which is this more meditative, like slower application of paint that also I associate with a contemplative painting, but hasn't been present in my painting specifically.
Thanks for that answer, Kadar.
Yeah.
We have a last question from Nat. Nat has asked me to ask on their behalf. Congrats, Kadar. What's next, or is that too soon? How are you feeling with the workup?
I feel a great sense of relief to have the show up. As some of my closer personal friends know, like last fall was a really difficult time for me. Just had some like real upheaval in my personal life. So these paintings were kind of worked on and worked through a lot of that. And I'm just excited to be able to have all these people that I like want to engage with, that I already engage with, that I care about, that I hope to care about in the future, to have the opportunity to see the work. Immediately, what's next is I'm getting the zine printed for this exhibition because my printer, who I love, is like I think they just took a longer vacation than usual this summer, so we're getting that printed, and then hopefully I can, I'm gonna try to do a little launch event for that. So that's immediately what I'm focused on, and just I'm already back in the studio painting and working on a number of things that were inspired also by this time that I spent in Berlin this summer. So I'm just really excited to be painting and making zines and I don't know, getting people to see the show while it's up.
Thank you so much to you and to Jason again for this conversation today. It's been a pleasure, and I know you're gonna close us out with a reading, so I'll pass you the mic for that now.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you to the Rail again for allowing us to have this little chat. It's super cool to share all this stuff with people. I am going to read a segment of an essay called "Nostalgia" by Svetlana Boym. It's from the internet, but it's an adaptation and elaboration on a segment of her book, "The Future of Nostalgia," which was published in 2001. She writes, in fact, there is a tradition of critical reflection on the modern condition that incorporates nostalgia. It can be called off-modern. The adverb off confuses our sense of direction and makes us explore side shadows and back alleys rather than the straight road of progress. It allows us to take a detour from the deterministic narrative of 20th century history. Off-modernism offered a critique of both the modern fascination with newness and the no less modern reinvention of tradition. In the off-modern tradition, reflection and longing, estrangement and affection go together. Modern nostalgia is paradoxical in the sense that the universality of longing can make us more empathetic towards fellow humans. Yet the moment we try to repair longing with a particular belonging, the apprehension of loss with a rediscovery of identity, and especially of a national community and a unique and pure homeland, we often part ways and put an end to mutual understanding. Algos, or longing, is what we share, yet nostos, the return home, is what divides us. It is the promise to rebuild the ideal home that lies at the core of many powerful ideologies of today, tempting us to relinquish critical thinking for emotional bonding. The danger of nostalgia is that it tends to confuse the actual home with an imaginary one. In extreme cases, it can create a phantom homeland for the sake of which one is ready to die or kill. Unelected nostalgia breeds monsters, yet the sentiment itself, the mourning of displacement and temporal irreversibility, is at the very core of the modern condition. Instead of a magic cure for nostalgia, I will offer a tentative typology and distinguish between two main types of nostalgia, the restorative and the reflective. Restorative nostalgia stresses nostos, home, and attempts the transhistorical reconstruction of the lost home. Reflective nostalgia thrives in algos, the longing itself, and delays the homecoming, wistfully, ironically, desperately. These distinctions are not absolute binaries, and one can surely make a more refined mapping of the gray areas on the outskirts of imaginary homelands. Restorative nostalgia does not think of itself as nostalgia, but rather as truth and tradition. Reflective nostalgia dwells on the ambivalences of human longing and belonging and does not shy away from the contradictions of modernity. Restorative nostalgia protects the absolute truth, while reflective nostalgia calls it into doubt. Do I have more time? Is this okay? Cool. Okay, I have two more paragraphs. Restorative nostalgia is at the core of recent national and religious revivals. It knows two main plots, the return to origins and the conspiracy. Reflective nostalgia does not follow a single plot, but explores ways of inhabiting many places at once and imagining different time zones. It loves details, not symbols. At best, it can present an ethical and creative challenge, not merely a pretext for midnight melancholies. If restorative nostalgia ends up reconstructing emblems and rituals of home and homeland in an attempt to conquer and specialize time, reflective nostalgia cherishes shattered fragments of memory and demoralizes space. Restorative nostalgia takes itself dead seriously. Reflective nostalgia, on the other hand, can be ironic and humorous. It reveals that longing and critical thinking are not opposed to one another, just as effective memories do not absolve one from compassion, judgment, or critical reflection. The 20th century began with a futuristic utopia and ended with nostalgia. The optimistic belief in the future has become outmoded, while nostalgia, for better or for worse, never went out of fashion, remaining uncannily contemporary. Contrary to what great actress Simone Signor, who entitled her autobiography "Nostalgia is Not What It Used to Be," thought, the structure of nostalgia is in many respects what it used to be, in spite of changing fashions and advances in digital technology. In the end, the only antidote for the dictatorship of nostalgia might be nostalgic dissidence. Nostalgia can be a poetic creation, an individual mechanism of survival, a countercultural practice, a poison, and a cure. It is up to us to take responsibility of our nostalgia and not let others prefabricate it for us. The prepackaged usable past may be of no use to us if we want to co-create our future. Perhaps dreams of imagined homelands cannot and should not come to life. Sometimes it is preferable, at least in the view of this nostalgic author, to leave dreams alone, let them be no more and no less than dreams, not guidelines for the future. While restorative nostalgia returns and rebuilds one's homeland with paranoid determination, reflective nostalgia fears return with the same passion. Home, after all, is not a gated community. Paradise on earth might turn out to be another Potemkin village with no exit. The imperative of contemporary nostalgia, to be homesick and to be sick of being at home occasionally at the same time.
Thank you, Kadar, for closing us out with that reading. And thank you to you and Jason again for this conversation today. Thank you to the team at Miles McHenry Gallery, especially for all the support in preparing for today's event, especially Jane. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Tiger Foundation, who sponsored the New Social Environment program and make conversations like this one possible. They also support the program's archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with George Abraham, Lana Barkawi, Moheb Soliman, and Cole Swenson on MISNA, a woman-led contemporary arts organization whose work questions and expands the forms and conceptual frameworks of Arab and Swana culture. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Jason.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Jason
guys.
Kadar.
Thank you, Kadar.
Thank you, Kadar. Congratulations.
Thanks, Kadar.
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Absolutely. Go see the show, everybody.
Thank you, Jason.
Take care,
you,
everyone.
Jason.